She had everything: the contract, the attorneys, the $100 million deal, and in 30 seconds, three masked men with shotguns took all of it away. One blast into the ceiling, marble dust raining down, 30 people hitting the floor. But while every hostage trembled and prayed, one man in a faded brown jacket did something that made Camille Hawthorne's blood go cold. He didn't panic, he counted. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel is where ordinary people reveal extraordinary secrets. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if this one grips you, smash that like button and stay until the very last word. You will not see this ending coming. The morning had started the way all important mornings do, with the specific, almost unbearable tension of something that actually matters. Camille Hawthorne arrived at First Meridian Bank at 9:47, 13 minutes early, because she had never once been late to anything that counted. Her attorneys walked on either side of her. Marcus Delray on the left, a compact, serious man who billed $400 an hour and earned every cent of it, and Priya Nath on the right, carrying the leather document case that held the contracts Camille had spent 18 months negotiating. Behind them came two assistants, one managing the digital portfolio, one carrying the hard copies, because Camille believed in redundancy the same way she believed in everything else, completely and without apology. The deal on the table was the Vantage Keller acquisition, $340 million. The kind of transaction that didn't just grow a company, it transformed one. Camille's company, Hawthorne Capital Ventures, had been building toward this moment for nearly 2 years, and the last few weeks had been the kind of sleepless, grinding push that reminded her why most people never reached this level. Not because they lacked intelligence, because they lacked endurance. She had both. The lobby of First Meridian was the old kind of beautiful. Carved stone columns, high ceilings with ornate plasterwork, floors that were actual marble rather than the imitation composite most modern banks used. The kind of building that said, "We have been here long enough to afford permanence." Camille appreciated that. She valued things that were built to last. She was shaking hands with Howard Venn, Keller Group's senior vice president, when she noticed the man sitting alone near the back row of waiting chairs. He was unremarkable in the way that certain men managed to be. Not unattractive, not particularly distinctive, wearing a faded brown jacket that had been washed enough times that the color had softened from what it once was. Early to mid-30s, maybe older. There was something around his eyes that made age harder to place. He held a printed transaction form on one knee and was filling it out with a ballpoint pen, the kind they kept chained to the customer service counters. His handwriting was small and precise. He didn't look up when Camille's group came in, didn't clock the attorneys, didn't show the mild, involuntary interest that most people displayed when a woman in a $1,200 suit walked into a room. She forgot about him immediately. Howard Venn was saying something about the signature timeline, and Marcus Delray was confirming the order of execution, and Priya was already opening the document case, and the entire world had narrowed to this: the pen, the paper, the line. They were given access to the bank's private consultation room, a glassed-in space off the main lobby, tasteful and quiet, with a rectangular table and upholstered chairs. Camille took her seat. Marcus laid out the documents in sequence. Priya produced 3 pens from an interior pocket of her blazer, because Camille had once watched a signing collapse at the last moment when a pen ran dry, and they had never repeated that mistake. Howard Venn removed his reading glasses from his jacket pocket and settled them onto his nose. He reached for the first document. The shotgun blast came through the ceiling before his hand reached the page. The sound was enormous, not just loud but physical, the kind of concussive report that doesn't just enter through the ears but punches through the chest wall. Dust and plaster fragments rained down from the ornate ceiling in a slow, dreamlike cascade. For a fraction of a second, nobody in the building processed what had happened. The brain does that. It reaches for the most reasonable explanation first: the burst pipe, the car backfire, the construction accident outside. Then the second shot hit the far wall above the teller stations, and the screaming started. "Down! Everybody on the floor! Now! Now!" 3 men. That was the first thing Camille registered when she pressed herself behind the consultation room table and tried to make sense of what her eyes were showing her. 3 men in black, faces covered by ski masks, moving through the lobby with the specific, purposeful aggression of people who had planned this and were executing the plan. The tallest one, the one who had fired both shots, carried a pistol-grip shotgun and was already directing the flow of hostages toward the center of the room with the kind of practiced authority that said this was not his first time doing something violent. The second man was at the entrance, chaining the main doors shut with a heavy padlock, then positioning himself with a pistol aimed at the windows. The third was moving through the teller area, forcing the staff out from behind the counter at gunpoint. There were perhaps 30 people in the bank: customers, tellers, a security guard who had already been disarmed and forced to his knees, two bank managers in matching gray blazers who were being herded together near the loan officer's desk. Some hostages were crying, some had their hands over their heads, some were simply frozen, operating in that particular state of disbelief that the human mind enters when reality breaks from everything it expected. Marcus grabbed Camille's arm. "Stay low," he said. His voice was surprisingly steady. She registered that, filed it. "I know," she said. "Come on." They moved from the consultation room into the lobby because the consultation room had glass walls and no secondary exit, and staying in a glass enclosure when armed men were controlling the space seemed like a worse option than joining the group. The logic was cold and clean, and she held on to it because the alternative, the fear that was pressing against the back of her throat like something physical, was not useful. The man in the faded brown jacket was already on the floor when Camille reached the main hostage area. He was on his knees, hands visible, the transaction form abandoned somewhere. His expression matched everyone else's. Wide eyes, slightly open mouth, the careful stillness of someone trying not to attract attention from a predator. She settled onto the marble floor 3 meters away from him, her back against a stone column, and tried to remember everything she had ever read about hostage situations. Most of what surfaced was useless. Corporate crisis management briefings from 6 years ago, a magazine article she'd skimmed on a flight. Her mind kept reaching for frameworks that didn't apply here, because nothing in her professional life had included being on a marble floor while a man with a shotgun walked 15 feet away. "Don't look at them," whispered the elderly woman beside her. She was perhaps 70, white-haired, with the careful composure of someone who had survived things before. "Look at the floor. Looking at them makes them nervous." Camille looked at the floor, but she looked at him first. The man in the brown jacket had changed. It was subtle enough that she almost missed it, and she would later understand that this was precisely the point. He was still positioned like a frightened hostage, low, still, unthreatening, but his eyes were moving with a quality that had nothing to do with fear. They were moving systematically, left to right, then back, then up, tracking ceiling angles and camera positions, and the spacing between columns in the way that a contractor surveys a room before renovation, noting load-bearing elements, identifying structural vulnerabilities, calculating distances. She watched him look at the main entrance doors, then the side corridor that led toward the bathrooms and the bank's back offices, then the emergency exit at the far end of the teller row, the one with the push-bar handle and the small red placard above it. He looked at each thing for perhaps 2 seconds, and then he didn't look at it again, as though he'd photographed it and filed it. Then he did something that made Camille blink. He moved a chair. Not dramatically. Not in a way that drew attention. He simply shifted his position slightly, and in doing so pushed the leg of an empty waiting chair perhaps 3 inches to the left. It looked accidental. The lead gunman glanced over and saw a frightened man adjusting his position on the floor, and he looked away. Camille looked at where the chair had been and where it was now, and tried to understand what 3 inches bought in a bank lobby. She couldn't figure it out, but she kept watching. Over the next 20 minutes, 20 minutes that felt like a much longer unit of time, measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. Camille watched the man in the brown jacket make 5 more adjustments. A leather satchel belonging to someone else nudged 18 inches toward the center of the floor. A metal trash receptacle near the service corridor tilted onto its side so that it partially blocked the narrow walkway between 2 desks. His own keys, produced from his jacket pocket with elaborate casualness, and set on the floor near his knee, glinting against the marble, placed in a spot that she gradually understood was directly beside the clearest path to the side corridor exit. None of it looked like anything. It looked like a frightened man fidgeting. It looked like the unconscious small adjustments people make when they're sitting on a hard floor and their body is trying to find comfort it can't find. But it wasn't. She didn't know what it was yet. But it wasn't that. The lead gunman was moving through the hostages now, doing what she'd heard called a compliance sweep, in some long-ago crisis management seminar, checking phones, taking valuables, establishing psychological dominance through proximity and unpredictability. He was good at it. He moved with a deliberate irregularity, pausing over some hostages for 30 seconds and moving past others in 5, so that nobody could predict when they'd be the focus of his attention. It was a technique. Camille recognized techniques. He stopped in front of a young mother who was holding a child of perhaps 4 years old. The woman had her arms wrapped around the child and was trying to muffle the child's crying against her shoulder. "Phone," the gunman said, not loudly. That was worse somehow. I left it in my car." "Phone," he said again, and held out his hand, and the woman dug into her purse with shaking fingers and produced it. He moved on. He stopped in front of a teenage boy who couldn't stop shaking, whose entire body was vibrating like a wire in wind, and stared at him for a long moment. "You're fine," the gunman said, not kindly, but not cruelly either. Matter of fact, like a man commenting on weather. "Stay still, and you're fine." The boy nodded. He didn't stop shaking, but the quality of it changed. When the gunman reached the man in the brown jacket, Camille held her breath without meaning to. "Look at me," the gunman said. The man looked up. His expression was a specific kind of frightened, the kind that's convincing because there's enough detail in it, the slight tension in the jaw, the eyes that don't quite meet the gunman's directly, the swallow. "What's your name?" "Ethan," he said. His voice was quieter than Camille expected. "Ethan Rourke." "What are you doing here, Ethan Rourke?" "Transferring money," Ethan said. "My daughter. She's starting community college in the fall, and I was moving money to her account. For tuition." Something small moved across the gunman's face. Not sympathy. Something more complicated. He looked at the transaction form on the floor near Ethan's knee. "How much?" Ethan hesitated. $4,200. I saved most of the summer for it." The gunman picked up the form, looked at it, set it back down. He moved on. Camille exhaled. She watched Ethan's face after the gunman passed. It was maybe 2 seconds. She might have imagined it. But there was a moment where the frightened expression dropped, just fractionally, and what was underneath it was something utterly calm. Not relieved, calm. The way a machine is calm. The way a system is calm. Then the fear came back, and he was just a man on the floor again. Priya was beside Camille, pressing close. "What do we do?" she whispered, barely a breath. "We wait," Camille said. She was watching Ethan's hands. He had retrieved his phone from his jacket pocket. She hadn't seen him do it, hadn't clocked the moment, but suddenly the phone was in his hand, resting against his thigh, screen down. "We wait, and we stay calm." "Are they going to hurt us?" "I don't know." She paused. "I don't think so. If they wanted to hurt people, they wouldn't have stopped." That was the calculation she was running. Robbery had an internal logic. Violence disrupted it. These men were organized enough to know that. But organized men under pressure could become something else entirely. The second gunman, the one near the entrance, had been checking through the window every 3 to 4 minutes with a clockwork consistency that suggested anxiety rather than alertness. He was watching for something. A car. A signal. Something outside that hadn't happened yet, and the not happening was wearing on him. The third man, who had moved the teller staff to the floor near the vault corridor, had a slight favoring in the way he stood. His weight shifted consistently to the right, the left knee bent slightly more often than the right. A subtle accommodation that the body makes for something that hurts. An old injury. Chronic. She noticed these things because she was the kind of woman who noticed things, and because her mind needed somewhere to go that wasn't pure terror, and cataloging the gunman was the most useful thing it could do. She did not yet understand that the man in the brown jacket had noticed all of this 7 minutes before she had. Marcus leaned toward her. "Camille." His voice was barely audible. "My phone has a signal. I can try to—" "No," she said immediately. "Don't. If they see the screen, I know. I'm saying I could try to get a message out without—" "Marcus." She looked at him. "Don't." He nodded. He didn't like it, but he nodded. The lead gunman was at the teller windows now, speaking quietly to the bank manager about the vault. The manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s named, according to his desk placard, Gerald Ashby, was shaking his head, and the gunman was responding with a patience that was more frightening than anger would have been. Camille looked back at Ethan Rourke. He was looking at her. Not the way people look at each other in crisis situations. The desperate, seeking look that asks, "Are you seeing this? Are you as scared as I am? Is there something we can do?" He was looking at her the way someone looks at a problem they're trying to account for. Calculating. Assessing. She held his gaze. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not no. More like not yet. Then he looked away and was frightened again, and Camille sat against her column and tried to understand what was happening in this room that she couldn't see clearly enough, and felt for the first time in her adult professional life that she was operating without the first idea of what the ground rules were. 20 feet away from her, the man who had come to the bank to pay his daughter's tuition reached under his thigh and did something with his phone that she didn't catch. She would learn later that he had activated the recorder. Every voice, every threat, every name and detail the gunman had let slip without knowing anyone was listening. He was building a case while they thought he was surviving. Camille Hawthorne had spent 18 months constructing a $340 million deal, and she was good at it. Methodical, patient, thorough. Watching Ethan Rourke work in that lobby, she understood she was looking at someone who did the same thing, with entirely different materials, in entirely different rooms. The contract on the table behind her didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the next 5 minutes, and the 5 after that, and whether the man in the faded brown jacket was building something fast enough. The thing about fear is that it has a smell. Camille had read that somewhere once, a psychology paper maybe, or one of those behavioral science books she consumed on long flights, and she had filed it away as interesting but abstract, the kind of fact that lives in the mind without ever becoming real. Standing in that lobby, or rather sitting on that marble floor with her back against a column, and 30 strangers packed around her like cargo, she understood it for the first time as a physical truth. Fear smelled like sweat and copper and something chemical underneath both, and it rose off the hostages in waves that the ventilation system couldn't touch. What it didn't smell like was the man 3 meters to her left. Ethan Rourke sat with his knees drawn up and his hands loose in his lap, and breathed at a rate that Camille found almost offensive given the circumstances. Slow. Even. The kind of breathing you do when you're sitting in a waiting room with a magazine, not when a man with a shotgun is pacing 20 feet from your head. She kept coming back to him the way you keep coming back to a loose thread. Not because you mean to pull it, but because it's there and your fingers know it. The lead gunman's name, she had gathered, was something that started with a D. The other two called him that once, and then stopped, which meant they'd been briefed not to use names and then forgot in the moment, which meant they were human, which meant they made mistakes. She'd cataloged that immediately. She suspected Ethan had cataloged it faster. He was doing something with his eyes that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't scanning, exactly. Scanning implied a sweep, a broad intake. What he was doing was more targeted than that. He would fix on something for 2, maybe 3 seconds, the way a camera focuses, and then release it and move on. The shotgun carrier's hands, the angle of the second man's body relative to the entrance doors, the third man's left knee, which continued its subtle accommodation every time he shifted his weight. Priya was crying quietly beside Camille. Not loudly, she had the professional's instinct to contain herself even in extremis, but her shoulders were shaking and her breath kept catching on the inhale in a way that Camille recognized as the precursor to something louder. She put her hand on Priya's arm without looking at her. "Keep breathing," Camille said, very low. "Don't stop breathing." "I can't. My kids." "I know. Keep breathing anyway." Marcus, on her other side, had gone very still in the way that certain men go still when they're frightened. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of something locked down hard against itself. He was staring at the floor tile directly in front of him. He hadn't moved in several minutes. Across the room, the bank manager, Gerald Ashby, was still in conversation with the lead gunman. The conversation had the quality of something that was going badly for one party, and that party was Gerald. His face had gone from frightened to something beyond frightened, a kind of pale, slightly luminous terror that made him look younger than his age, like the flesh had lost its armature. "I don't have override access," Gerald was saying. "The vault has a time lock. It doesn't open until 11:15. I can't. It's not something I can change. It's automated." "Then we wait until 11:15, the gunman said. "That's 40 minutes. I know how time works. Gerald swallowed. There are children here. The gunman looked at the young mother in the corner, the 4-year-old who had finally stopped crying and gone into the flat, exhausted quiet of a child who has cried past what crying can do. He looked at them for a moment. Nobody's going to get hurt if everyone does what I say, he said. He turned back to Gerald. 40 minutes. Camille processed this. 40 minutes was a long time by any reasonable measure. 40 minutes was also, she recognized, long enough for police response if anyone had managed to get a call out. The security guard had been disarmed in the first 30 seconds, but someone might have gotten to a phone. Someone might have run out before the doors were chained. She didn't know. She had no external information, and the absence of it was its own specific kind of claustrophobia. She looked at Ethan again. He was looking at the ceiling. Not broadly. He wasn't staring up at the ornate plasterwork the way a person might when they're trying to find something neutral to rest their eyes on. I was tracking something specific. The position of the security cameras, she realized. The bank had 4 of them mounted at the ceiling corners, the standard configuration, and he was working out their angles of coverage, mapping which areas of the floor were visible from which camera, and, more to the point, she suspected, which areas weren't. Then he looked at her. She had the sense he'd been aware of her watching him for some time and had simply allowed it, the way you allow something that doesn't change the calculation. She mouthed very carefully, "What are you doing?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something drier than that. He shook his head slightly, the same small gesture as before, the one that meant not yet, and looked away. The second gunman, the one at the entrance, had checked the window for the 5th time in what Camille estimated was 20 minutes. He was looking for something specific, and it still hadn't appeared, and the not appearing was doing something to his body language that she didn't like. His posture had tightened. His movements were getting smaller and more frequent, the way a spring compresses when you load it. "Hey," the lead gunman from across the room. "Stop checking the window." "I just want to make sure." "Stop checking the window. You're making everybody nervous." The second man turned away from the glass. His jaw was set in a way that said he didn't like being told, which meant there was friction in this operation, which meant that whatever coordination they'd established was under pressure. She filed this. Ethan filed it 3 seconds ahead of her. She watched him make his next adjustment. It was the most subtle thing yet. He had shifted his position slightly over the past several minutes, not in one movement, but in a series of almost imperceptible increments, the way a plant turns toward light, too slowly to catch in real time. He was now sitting approximately 18 inches from where he'd started. The new position placed him with a clearer sight line to the service corridor entrance on the left side of the room, and his keys, still on the floor beside his knee, still glinting, were now directly on the path between his current position and that corridor. She looked at the keys, then at the corridor, then at Ethan. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his hands. She thought about what 40 minutes meant to a man who thought the way he thought, and something shifted in her chest. Not comfort, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sense that there was a mind at work in this room that was ahead of the problem rather than behind it. It didn't make the shotgun less real, or the marble floor less cold, or Priya's quiet crying less heartbreaking. But it changed the quality of the waiting. Gerald Ashby had retreated to sit with the other bank employees near the loan desks. He looked hollowed out. The woman beside him, one of the tellers, young, with a long braid she kept touching the end of, was speaking to him in low tones that Camille couldn't hear. Gerald was nodding without looking like he was absorbing anything. The third gunman came through the hostage group doing another sweep. He was collecting phones more thoroughly this time, less patient about it, pulling them from pockets and bags with a brusqueness that said the first sweep had been about establishing control, and this one was about something more practical. He was looking for active connections, someone who had managed to leave a line open. He reached a heavy-set man in a business suit, mid-50s, red-faced, the kind of man who seemed built for conference rooms and was not built for this. And the man pulled his phone out immediately and held it up, hands shaking. "It's off," the man said. "I turned it off when they told us. It's off, see?" The gunman took it, looked at it, handed it back. "Keep it off." "Of course, yeah, absolutely." He moved on. He reached a young man, mid-20s, earbuds still around his neck from before, who also complied immediately. He reached the elderly woman who had advised Camille to look at the floor, and she held out a phone that looked at least 6 years old with a dignity that was almost remarkable, like she was presenting credentials at a border crossing. Then he reached Ethan. Camille felt herself go still. "Phone," the gunman said. Ethan produced it from his jacket pocket and held it up. "Screen on." The gunman looked at it. Camille could see from her angle that the screen showed what appeared to be a banking app. A transfer confirmation screen, numbers visible. "You were in the middle of a transaction," the gunman said. "Yeah." Ethan's voice had that same quality as before, slightly thinned, the register of a man holding himself together with effort. "Tuition payment. I hadn't finished when everything—" He stopped. "Let the sentence trail off the way frightened people let sentences trail off." The gunman held the phone for a moment, then handed it back. "Lock it," he said. "Okay," Ethan said, and he pressed the side button and the screen went dark. But Camille had been watching his thumb, and his thumb hadn't touched the lock button. His thumb had touched something on the side of the screen that was slightly lower than the lock button, in the position where, on certain phone models, the voice memo function could be activated with the screen appearing locked while the recording continued. She wasn't certain, she couldn't be certain. But she thought about the fact that he had recorded something before this moment, had been running the recorder since the first sweep, and she thought about what that recording might now contain. Voices, details, operational chatter that the gunman believed was disappearing into the air of a controlled space. And she felt something move through her that wasn't quite awe, but was built from the same materials. The third gunman moved on. Ethan sat with his dark screen in his lap and breathed his infuriating, steady breath. Around them, the hostages had settled into the particular arrangement that people find in sustained crisis. Small groups, proximity seeking, the unconscious human tendency to cluster. The young mother had been joined by two other women who had migrated toward her child the way adults migrate toward children in danger, the protective instinct overriding the self-preserving one. Gerald Ashby's group had grown to include most of the bank staff. Marcus had moved closer to Camille without acknowledging that he was doing it. Priya had stopped crying. She was doing what Camille had told her, breathing, just breathing, and the color was coming back to her face in increments. "How long?" Priya asked. "The manager said 40 minutes for the vault. We're maybe 20 in." "And then what?" "Then they take what they came for, and they leave." Camille said it with more conviction than she had, because conviction was contagious, and so was its absence, and she'd spent enough time in rooms where both were present to know which one served better. Priya nodded. She clearly didn't fully believe it, but she held on to it. The lead gunman, D, whatever his full name was pacing now. The pacing was new. For the first 20 minutes he'd moved through the room with controlled purpose, but the pacing was different. It was the kind of movement that externalizes internal pressure, the body burning off what the mind can't contain. He was checking his watch. He was looking at the vault corridor. He was doing the math on how the next 20 minutes needed to go. And something about the math was not satisfying him. He looked at the hostages with an expression that Camille had no good name for. Not predatory, more appraising, looking for something he could use. His eyes settled on her. She kept her face neutral. She'd spent enough years in rooms where people tried to read her face to know how to make it give nothing. But she felt the attention land on her and knew what it meant before he started walking toward her. He crouched in front of her. This close, she could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket, and something else, a faintly chemical edge to his sweat that might have been adrenaline or might have been something pharmaceutical. Either way, it told her his system was running hot. "You," he said. "You came in with the lawyers." "I did," she said. "The consultation room. That deal you were doing. That was real money." She looked at him steadily. "It was a business transaction." "What kind of business?" "Acquisitions." Something flickered in his expression. Not respect, more like recalibration. He'd expected her to shrink and she hadn't, and he was deciding what to do with that. "You got money." "I have access to funds, yes." "How much can you move, right now, from your phone?" She understood immediately what he was doing and why, and she also understood that the correct answer was not the true one. "I'd need to speak with my bank directly. It's not the kind of transfer you make from an app. There are authorization protocols. I'm not asking about protocols." He leaned forward slightly. Not threatening. "Worse, conversational, like they were negotiating, like they were the same kind of person operating in the same framework. I'm asking how much you can move. I don't carry liquid cash in accessible accounts, she said. It's all tied up in instruments. You'd need days to liquidate anything meaningful. He stared at her for a long moment. She held it. He stood up. Don't lie to me, he said, not loudly. I'm not lying to you, she said. I'm explaining how corporate finance works. He walked away. She let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding, slow and careful so no one would see it. Her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs. From across the room, she felt rather than saw Ethan watching her. When she looked up, he was in fact watching her, not with the assessing look from before, but with something that was harder to categorize. He held her gaze for a moment, and then gave a very small nod. The kind of nod that means that was right rather than hello. She looked away. The next several minutes were a particular kind of terrible. The sustained, grinding anxiety of waiting for something to happen without knowing what the something would be. The vault countdown was ticking somewhere that Camille couldn't see. The second gunman had stopped checking the window, but his jaw was tight and his free hand kept opening and closing. The third man with the bad knee was sitting on the edge of a desk now, his weight off the leg, which told her the standing was getting difficult. Then something changed in the room. It was the lead gunman's voice, and it wasn't directed at Gerald or the staff or anyone with obvious utility. It was directed at the room at large, and it had a quality that Camille's nervous system processed before her brain caught up. A specific pitch that said the plan had shifted. "Everybody listen," he said. "Change of plans." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "The vault opens in 15 minutes. We don't need all of you in here for that." He paused. "But we need one of you to send a message." He looked at Camille, and she understood, in the way you understand things that you would give almost anything not to understand, exactly what kind of message he meant. He crossed the room in a dozen steps, and she was already on her feet. Not because she had decided to stand, but because her body had decided for her. Some ancient wire tripped that said, "Don't be pulled up, stand." And his hand was on her arm, and the shotgun was at a downward angle that was worse than if he'd pointed it directly at her, because the angle said casualness. The angle said she was already secured and the weapon was incidental. "You'll do," he said. "Take your hand off me," she said. He almost laughed. "Lady, my name is Camille Hawthorne." She said it the way she said her name in boardrooms, the full weight of it. "You're going to want to remember that for when this is over." The almost laugh became something else. His grip tightened. "The vault," said a voice from across the room. The gunman looked up. Ethan Rourke was on his feet. He hadn't moved quickly. She hadn't seen him stand, hadn't clocked the moment of it. He was simply standing now, hands visible and open at his sides. His body language the embodiment of non-threat. His voice, when he'd spoken, had been completely flat. No fear, no bravado. Just a statement delivered in the same register you'd use to say it's raining. "What?" the gunman said. "The vault," Ethan said again. "You don't need her to send a message. You need the vault. And there's a problem with it that Gerald doesn't know about because it's in a section of the building he doesn't have clearance for." The grip on Camille's arm didn't loosen, but the gunman's attention had moved, and attention, she had learned today, was the only real currency in this room. "What are you talking about?" the gunman said. Ethan's expression was careful, controlled, a man who was frightened but had something to offer, playing the only card he had. "There's a secondary bypass panel," he said, "in the maintenance corridor. It's not on the bank's standard schematics because it was installed during a security upgrade 3 years ago. The time lock has an override built into it, not for staff, for external auditors, but the mechanism is accessed from a panel behind the HVAC housing in the service hall." The room had gone absolutely silent. "And you know this how?" the gunman said. A pause. Ethan's jaw moved slightly. "Because I did the security installation," he said. "I worked for the contracting company 3 years ago. It was a lie so specific and so detailed and delivered so completely without performance that Camille almost believed it herself. And she knew, with a certainty she couldn't fully explain, that it was a lie. There was something in the precision of it, the way it accounted for exactly what the gunman needed and nothing more, that had the quality of something constructed rather than recalled. But it didn't matter whether she believed it. The gunman believed it, or at least the gunman believed it enough. Believed it enough to calculate that the upside of it being true was worth more than the risk of it being false, because if it was true, it changed everything about the next 15 minutes. His grip on Camille's arm loosened. Not gone. He didn't release her, but the quality of it changed from possession to pause. "Show me," he said to Ethan. Ethan nodded. His eyes moved to Camille for a fraction of a second. Briefest contact, a thing that happened and was gone. And then he looked at the gunmen. "Okay," he said. "I'll show you." The lead gunman looked at his partners. He made a decision in the 2 seconds that decision-making takes when you're in motion and everything is moving around you. He pointed at the second man. "Stay on the doors." He looked at the third. "Stay with them. Anyone moves, you know what to do." "You got it," the third man said. The lead gunman kept one hand on Camille's arm and took Ethan with the other, and the three of them moved toward the service corridor entrance on the left side of the room. The one Ethan had been tracking since the beginning, the one his keys were placed beside, the one he had been navigating toward in increments so small that nobody, not even Camille who had been watching him, had understood where he was going until he was already there. She understood now. She understood all of it now, or enough of it, and the understanding was extraordinary and terrifying, and she had no way to act on it except to walk where the gunman pulled her. And trust, without any real basis for trust, the man in the faded brown jacket who had come to the bank to pay his daughter's tuition and had been quietly, methodically, invisibly rearranging the room against 3 armed men for the better part of an hour. The hostages watched them go. The third gunman stood over them with his weight on his right leg and his left knee, quietly announcing its complaint. And somewhere in the tangle of everything, the fear and the cold floor and the crying that had started again from somewhere in the back of the room, Camille heard the small, specific sound of the service corridor door swinging open and then closing, and then the lobby was very quiet and the waiting began again. But it was a different kind of waiting now. Something had already been set in motion that the gunman didn't know about, in the same way that you don't know a room has been rearranged until you walk into it in the dark, and the furniture is exactly where you don't expect it to be. Ethan Rourke had been building this for an hour. He was done building. The service corridor was a different world. Out in the lobby, everything was marble and height, and the particular grandeur that old banks used to announce their permanence. Back here, it was exposed conduit and fluorescent tubes and the smell of cleaning fluid and something mechanical underneath that, the working guts of a building that had been presenting a different face to the public for 100 years. The ceiling dropped to 8 feet. The floor was sealed concrete. The corridor ran maybe 60 feet before it branched left toward the HVAC room and right toward the loading dock, and the light had that flat institutional quality that makes everyone look slightly unwell. The lead gunman pushed Camille ahead of him and kept the shotgun at a downward angle, not touching her, not quite, but close enough that the proximity was its own instruction. Ethan walked 2 steps in front of them both, his hands visible, his pace measured. He moved through the corridor with the careful, slightly hesitant body language of a man who is trying to remember something he learned years ago, which was a performance, and Camille was watching it closely enough by now to see it as what it was. She was also watching everything else. The corridor was narrow enough that the gunman had to make a choice. Keep hold of Camille or keep the shotgun in 2 hands, but not comfortably do both. He had opted to release her arm once they were through the door and into the corridor, replacing physical grip with proximity and the weapon. She was 3 feet from the wall on her left and 4 feet from the gunman on her right, and Ethan was perhaps 8 feet ahead of them, and she ran these numbers the way she ran numbers in every room she entered, not because the numbers told her what to do, but because having them was better than not. "How far?" the gunman said. "Second branch on the left," Ethan said, "past the HVAC housing. You worked on this building 3 years ago, and you remember the layout." It wasn't quite a question. Ethan half turned as he walked, the way you do when you're answering someone behind you. "I do electrical and low-voltage installation. You spend enough time in a building's infrastructure, you remember it, same way you remember a neighborhood you grew up in." A pause. "Where'd you work before this?" "Different places," Ethan said. "Whatever the company had." "Where are you now?" "Laid off 8 months ago. Doing day labor when I can get it." He glanced back again, and his expression in the flat corridor light was the right kind of tired. Not performed, just worn. "Why do you think I'm transferring $4,000 and calling it tuition? That's everything I saved." The gunman was quiet. Camille marked the quiet carefully. There was something happening in the man's head that was more complicated than the tactical calculation. She could see it in the slight change around his eyes, the fractional loosening of a jaw that had been locked all morning. He was doing what people do when someone tells them something that rhymes with their own experience, which was the most dangerous thing Ethan could have provoked, because it meant the man was beginning, even slightly, to think of Ethan as a person rather than an obstacle. She didn't know yet whether Ethan was doing that on purpose. She was beginning to suspect everything Ethan did was on purpose. They reached the branch. Ethan turned left. The HVAC housing was a large gray metal box mounted to the wall at about shoulder height, and the noise from it was a constant low thrum that pressed against the ears in a way that wasn't painful but was relentless. Beside it was a maintenance panel, gray, bolted, the kind that's everywhere in commercial buildings, and that nobody ever opens unless something breaks. Ethan stopped in front of it. "Here," he said. The gunman moved forward to look, which meant he moved past Camille by about a foot, and she registered this. The slight shift in geometry, the slight change in where the barrel was pointing as his attention moved toward the panel. Ethan unlatched the panel and pulled it open. Inside was the expected interior of a maintenance access point, conduit runs, labeled circuits, a junction block. He pointed to the lower left corner of the panel. "The override module should be behind that secondary housing," he said. "The installer bracket. See the bolt pattern there? That's non-standard. That's the addition." The gunman leaned in slightly, looking. Ethan dropped a pen. It was such a small thing, a cheap ballpoint pen, the kind from the bank's customer service counter. He must have palmed it during the lobby phase, must have been carrying it since the first sweep. And it hit the concrete floor with a thin metallic click and rolled 3 inches and stopped. He bent to pick it up, which was natural, which anyone would do, except that in the bending he left his right hand on the floor for a fraction of a second longer than the motion required. And when he straightened, his hand was empty and the pen was in his pocket. But the position of his right hand had changed. She didn't understand what he'd done. She understood 40 seconds later. "There's a secondary relay behind the housing," Ethan said. "I'd need a flathead to get the bracket off. You have anything like that? Or I can look in the—" "Stop talking," the gunman said. He was staring at the panel with the particular focused attention of a man who is trying to evaluate something outside his expertise and knows it. "Is this real or are you wasting my time?" "It's real," Ethan said. "The module is there. The time lock bypass is there. I'm not going to make something up when you're holding a shotgun." "People make things up when I'm holding a shotgun," the gunman said. "That's usually exactly when they make things up." "Then you know what it sounds like?" Ethan said. "Does this sound like that?" "A beat. 2. "Show me how the override works," the gunman said. "Walk me through it." "I need the bracket off first. The mechanism isn't accessible without removing it." The gunman reached into his jacket and produced a multi-tool, the folding kind, the ones that contractors and outdoors people and a certain type of organized person carry. And Ethan took it and unfolded the flathead and began working the bracket bolts. His movements were deliberate and slightly clumsy, the clumsiness of concentration, and he talked while he worked in the quiet, technical way of someone who knows a system. "The module itself has 2 inputs," he said, "primary and secondary. The primary is what the bank staff uses for normal operation. That's what Gerald accesses. The secondary is for external audit access, which is why it's not on the internal schematics. Different key system entirely." "What kind of key?" "Digital, 6-digit code. It was set during installation and the auditors have it." "You know it?" Ethan paused his work. "I set it," he said. "The installation team sets the initial code and the auditors change it at first use. If it was never audited, and this bank's had issues, their compliance record is not great. The code might still be original." The gunman looked at him. "How do you know their compliance record?" "Because the job got complicated," Ethan said. "There was a dispute about the installation contract. I looked into the bank's background when I thought it might go to arbitration." He went back to the bracket. "It didn't, but I remember things." It was extraordinarily good. Camille stood in the corridor and watched a man construct a fiction out of precise technical language and authentic-sounding personal history, and the kind of specific, unglamorous detail that real stories have and invented ones often don't. And she felt something that was almost admiration, except that underneath the admiration was a question she couldn't stop circling. Who is this man? The bracket came off. Ethan set it aside on the floor. Inside the secondary housing was exactly what you'd expect to find in a commercial building's maintenance panel. More conduit, more labeled wiring, a small terminal block. Nothing that looked like a vault override. Nothing that looked like anything special at all. Ethan stared at it for a moment. The gunman stared at it. "Where's the module?" the gunman said. "It should be." Ethan leaned in closer. "It should be mounted here. This bracket pattern. It was mounted here." "Should be or is?" "Was," Ethan said. "They moved it." He leaned back. His jaw tightened in a way that read as frustrated rather than afraid. "They must have relocated it during a subsequent maintenance cycle. This happens. The original install gets modified and the documentation doesn't keep up." Silence in the corridor except for the HVAC thrum. The gunman said very quietly, "You're wasting my time." "I'm not," Ethan said. "The module exists. It was here, it's been moved, probably to the secondary panel in the equipment room, which is the other branch, about 40 feet down." "Stop!" The gunman's voice had changed, not louder, denser. "You're taking me on a tour of this building." Ethan met his eyes. "I'm trying to find something that helps you." "Why?" "Because there are children out there," Ethan said. "And I have a daughter, and I want this to be over." It was, Camille thought, probably the truest thing he'd said in the past 20 minutes, and it landed the way true things do, differently than everything around them. But the gunman was past the point where true things changed his math. She saw it happen, saw the calculation complete behind his eyes, saw the moment where possibility collapsed into conclusion, and the conclusion was that Ethan had been stalling, and he'd been stalling skillfully, and the skillfulness itself was now the problem, because it implied something about what Ethan was that was incompatible with the frightened day laborer in the faded jacket. "On your knees," the gunman said. He raised the shotgun, and in the half-second before everything changed, Camille saw Ethan's face change first. The tired, careful performance, all of it, every layer of it, dropped. Not gradually, all at once, like a coat shrugged off. What was underneath was something that had been waiting there the entire time, patient, in the way that only things that have been waiting for a very long time can be patient. And it was not frightened, and it was not performing, and it had the specific contained quality of a system that has been counting down to a number that has now arrived. Ethan moved before the shotgun came level. It wasn't athletic in the way that action looks athletic. No flourish, no excess motion, nothing that a camera would frame as heroic. It was brutally efficient, the way a machine is efficient, each movement doing exactly one thing and nothing else. His left hand came up and caught the barrel of the shotgun from the outside and pushed it toward the wall. Not grabbing, pushing, redirecting the line of fire away from the corridor and into the concrete. And the gun went off. The sound was enormous. In the enclosed corridor, it was beyond loud. It was a physical event, a pressure wave that Camille felt in her chest and her ears simultaneously, and that knocked her backward one step against the opposite wall. The blast went into the concrete above the maintenance panel and left a ragged gray crater and a cloud of gypsum dust and debris. The gunman's grip on the shotgun hadn't broken, but the blast had pushed his weight backward and his balance had compromised, one heel catching on an uneven join in the concrete floor, and Ethan used that. Use the eighth of a second of compromised balance the way you use a door that's swinging your direction, not fighting it, but flowing through it. His right hand came across the gunman's forearm in a controlled sweep that broke the grip, and then he rotated the weapon inward, and it was simply no longer in the gunman's hands. The way a thing is no longer where you left it when someone else has moved it while you were looking elsewhere. The gunman reacted immediately and correctly. He went for the pistol at his hip rather than trying to recover the shotgun, which was the right tactical instinct, and he was fast with it. Faster than Camille expected. Ethan was faster. The pistol was 3/4 of the way out of the holster when Ethan trapped the drawing hand, not by grabbing the wrist, but by pinning the elbow against the wall with his forearm, locking the draw motion, and then his knee came up hard into the outside of the gunman's thigh. Not the standard knee strike, but targeted, aimed at the muscle rather than the joint, and the effect was immediate and practical. The leg buckled, the weight shifted, the center of gravity dropped, and a man without his center of gravity cannot effectively fight or draw a weapon or do much of anything except respond to gravity, which the gunman did. He hit the wall and went down. Ethan put him down the rest of the way with a controlled takedown that ended with the gunman face first on the concrete floor, both arms pinned behind him. Ethan's weight distributed across his back in a way that was immovable without being injurious. The whole sequence had taken perhaps 4 seconds, possibly less. Camille was pressed against the corridor wall with both hands flat against the concrete and her heart doing something she didn't have language for. And the dust was still settling from the shotgun blast, and the HVAC unit was still running its relentless thrum, and Ethan was holding a man down on the floor with a calm that was almost more shocking than the violence had been. "Don't," Ethan said to the man on the floor, very quietly. "Just stop." A beat. 2. The gunman stopped. Ethan looked up at Camille. His voice when he spoke was even. Not the artificial evenness of performance, something older than that. "Are you hurt?" She checked herself without meaning to, the automatic inventory. "No." "Good." He looked back down at the man beneath him. "I'm going to need your belt," he said, "and your partner's, if you're going to tell me where he keeps his." The gunman said nothing. "The belt," Ethan said again. Not threatening, just present. Camille pushed off the wall. Her legs were less reliable than she wanted them to be. "What do you need me to do?" "The pen I dropped," Ethan said. "It's on the floor about 3 feet from the panel. Pick it up." She found it. It was an ordinary ballpoint, except that it wasn't. When she looked at it, she could see that the clip had been bent and repositioned, and there was something about the way the barrel had been modified, a notch worn into it, that suggested it had been used as something other than a pen before today. "What is this?" she said. "A way to keep the latch on that maintenance panel from closing completely," he said. "I needed a gap in the door frame down the corridor, for sound. I needed to hear whether the secondary alarm tripped." She stared at him. "The pen goes in the gap," he said patiently, "so the door doesn't seal, so I can hear the alarm." "What alarm?" "The one I tripped when I put my hand on the floor," he said. "There's a motion-activated emergency panel at floor level behind the maintenance access. It was installed after a flood incident. It monitors water accumulation, but it also has a secondary function as a silent alarm to the building's external monitoring service. It's not on the bank's internal system. Gerald wouldn't know about it." She looked at the floor where he'd touched it. There was nothing there. Or rather, there was a ventilation grill set flush with the concrete, and behind the grill, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it, was a small panel with a red indicator light that had been off when they entered the corridor and was now on. "You knew that was there," she said. "I knew buildings like this have them," he said. "I didn't know exactly where. I was looking." "That's why you dropped the pen, to look at the floor." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, distantly, through the gap that the bent pen clip would hold in the door, she could hear something that might have been a siren. Might have been. Far away still. "How long?" she said. "Response time for the monitoring service to verify and relay to police dispatch. 8 to 12 minutes, if the monitoring company is competent. I've been timing. We're past 7. "And the lobby," she said. The thought surfaced with a cold specificity. "There are 2 more men in the lobby." "I know. One of them is going to hear that shot." "I know that too." The gunman on the floor shifted slightly. Ethan increased his weight fractionally, and the shifting stopped. "Belt," Ethan said again. "Last time I'm asking." "Go to hell," the gunman said. "Okay." Ethan looked at Camille. "His jacket has an interior pocket on the left side. There should be zip ties in it. These operations usually carry restraints. I need you to reach in and get them." She didn't think about it. She crossed to the gunman, found the pocket, found the zip ties, 3 of them, heavy-duty, the construction supply kind, and handed them to Ethan. He restrained the gunman with a practiced efficiency that answered questions she hadn't asked yet. 3 ties, combined into a figure-8 restraint on the wrists, then anchored to a conduit run along the wall, high enough that the man couldn't stand without pulling against it. It wasn't cruel, but it was completely effective. Ethan stood up. He picked up the shotgun from the floor, checked the chamber, the action, made several adjustments that she watched but couldn't follow, and then held it in a way that was completely different from the way the gunman had held it. Lower, closer to the body, less display, more utility. He looked at Camille. She had her arms crossed against her chest and was doing that breathing thing she'd told Priya to do. Just breathing, just keeping the machinery running. and she was looking at him with an expression that even she couldn't name. "You need to tell me something," she said, "right now before we go back in there. Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not reluctance, more like a habit of privacy that he was making a decision about. "Ethan Rourke," he said. "That's your name." "That's not what I'm asking." Another moment. "I was in the Navy," he said. "A long time ago." "Doing what?" "The part they don't put in the recruitment materials," he said. And then, "I need to move. We have less than 3 minutes before that shot brings the man from the entrance back here." She let it go. Not because she'd stopped wanting the answer, but because 3 minutes was 3 minutes and she understood priority sequencing. "What do we do?" she said. "You go back to the lobby," he said. "Keep low, stay to the left wall, get back to your group. When things happen, get everyone behind the teller counter. It's the most covered position in the room." "What things?" "The alarm should be bringing police to the perimeter. Once there's police presence, the dynamic in the lobby is going to change, and not for the better initially. The man with the knee, the third one, he's the one to watch. He's the most likely to do something irrational when it gets loud." "And you?" "I'm going to take the long way back," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Ethan." He was already moving toward the far end of the corridor, toward the other branch, the one that ran toward the loading dock and whatever geography lay beyond it. He looked back at her once. "The teller counter," he said. "Left side. Stay there." Then he was gone around the corner. Camille stood alone in the corridor with the HVAC thrum and the distant possible siren and the gunman zip-tied to the conduit, who was beginning to understand that his situation had changed fundamentally and was expressing this in quiet, vicious terms that she chose not to engage with. She took 2 seconds, allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of standing still in a corridor where a shotgun had gone off 20 feet from her head, and a man she didn't know had just walked away from her in a direction she couldn't follow. Then she went back to the lobby. She came through the service corridor door low and to the left the way he'd told her, and nobody shot her. And she crossed the floor quickly to where Marcus and Priya were pressed together near the column, and Marcus grabbed her arm the moment she was close enough. "We heard a shot," he said. "What? Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "Get everyone behind the teller counter. Now, before something happens. Left side. Move now. Do it quietly." "Where's the man who—" "Marcus." She looked at him. "Now." He moved. He was good at being told what to do by a woman who meant it. The third gunman, the one with the bad knee, had heard the shot too. He was at the service corridor door now, standing in front of it, his weight on the right leg, pistol raised, listening. His attention was on the corridor, not the hostages, which meant his back was partially to the room. Camille moved the hostages. It took 90 seconds, and it took the kind of quiet coordination that people manage when they're frightened enough and clear instructions exist. She got Marcus moving first, then Priya, then gestured to the elderly woman and the young mother, and the group began migrating in low, controlled movements toward the teller counter on the far side of the room. The third gunman heard them when they were halfway there. He spun around. "What are you doing? Get back! Everybody stop! Get back where you were!" And from somewhere outside the building came the sound of tires, and then voices amplified through a bullhorn, and then the hard, distinct wail of multiple police units closing in from at least 2 directions. The third gunman went very still. The second gunman, the one who had been chained at the entrance, said something that was mostly profanity, moving away from the doors toward the center of the room, and the chained doors were now the problem because people were on the other side of them with intentions that were the opposite of his. "Keep moving," Camille said to the hostages, low and urgent. "Behind the counter. Left side, go." "Shut up," the third gunman said. He was sweating now. The knee was bad and his situation was worse, and the thing about the bullhorn outside was that it announced a closing, and a closing meant choices were narrowing, and narrowing choices did something to people that was not predictable. He raised the pistol. Not at anyone specific. At the room. The worst kind of raise because it meant the target was wherever panic pointed it. "Everyone on the floor," he said. "On the floor right now, I will—" The door at the back of the teller area opened. Not the service corridor door, the door at the very back of the teller row, the one that led to the bank's administrative offices, the one that had been closed and irrelevant for the entire duration of the morning, the one that nobody had thought about because there was no reason to think about it. Ethan came through it. He had taken the long way back. The loading dock, she would understand later, connected to the administrative wing, which connected to the teller row, which connected to everywhere that mattered. He had moved through the building's service infrastructure at a pace and with a route that she couldn't reconstruct from the available information, and he had arrived at a position that was directly behind the third gunman and 8 feet to his left. He didn't announce himself. He didn't give a speech. He crossed the 8 feet in a movement that was almost quiet on the hard floor, and he hit the third gunman from the blind side with a controlled strike to the shoulder that spun the man's shooting arm away from the room, and then his other arm came across the front of the man's chest and pulled him backward and off balance, and the bad knee collapsed exactly as Ethan had known it would. And the two of them went down together, except that Ethan was in control of the going down and the gunman wasn't. The pistol hit the floor and skittered under the counter. The gunman hit the floor and didn't get up. Across the room, the second man watched this happen. He watched it for maybe 2 seconds, which was long enough for him to understand the geometry of his situation completely. One partner restrained in a corridor he couldn't reach. One partner on the floor. Police outside. A man standing up from a takedown who is holding himself the way people hold themselves when they've done this before and will do it again as many times as necessary. He put the pistol on the floor. He put his hands on his head. He said something that was lost under the bullhorn voice outside, but that read, from its physical components, like some version of surrender. The lobby was quiet for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then someone started crying, and someone else said something that Camille couldn't hear, and then 3 more people were crying, and the young mother's child began again from wherever they had gone to ground behind the counter. Marcus was beside Camille. "Is it over?" he said. She was watching Ethan, who was kneeling beside the third gunman, checking something, his movements still that specific quality of economy. No excess, nothing wasted, just the thing that needed doing done in exactly the way it needed doing. "Yes," she said. Ethan looked up from the floor and found her across the room. There was sweat on his forehead and a cut on his left hand she hadn't seen him sustain, and his jacket had torn at the shoulder seam, and he looked nothing at all like the man she had first catalogued as another exhausted working father. He looked like exactly what he was. She didn't know yet what that was. But she looked at him across the wreckage of a morning that had started with a $340 million contract and ended with a man she didn't know keeping 30 people alive through an hour of careful, invisible work. And she thought about what it means to have power in a room, what it actually means, stripped of the money and the titles and the attorneys and the leather document cases. And she didn't have a clean conclusion to reach, but she felt something shift in her that was going to take a long time to locate and name. The bullhorn voice outside resolved into specific words. Police. Hands. The doors. The lobby filled with sound, and then it filled with people, and then it was over. 30 hostages. No shots fired by the police. No injuries beyond a cut on Ethan's hand that he was already wrapping with the inside of his jacket lining, tearing a strip of fabric with the practical indifference of a man who had dealt with worse. He hadn't fired a single round. The shotgun was still in his left hand when the first officer came through the door, and he put it immediately on the floor and moved away from it and raised both hands, which was the right thing to do and which he did without being told. And Camille watched the officer approach him with the standard intensity of someone who doesn't yet understand the room, and she stepped forward. "That man," she said, and her voice carried in a way she'd spent years cultivating, "is not your problem." The officer looked at her. "My name is Camille Hawthorne," she said. "That man just kept 30 people alive. Get your supervisor." The parking lot outside First Meridian Bank looked, within 20 minutes of the breach, like the staging ground for something much larger than a robbery. 4 patrol units, 2 unmarked sedans, an ambulance that had arrived with its lights on and was now idling with them off, because the radio communication had clarified that the injuries were minor and the situation was contained. A mobile command vehicle was pulling in from the north end of the block, its roof antenna array still extending as it rolled. News vans were clustering at the perimeter tape 200 feet out, cameras up, reporters doing the thing reporters do when they arrive just after the fact, manufacturing urgency about something that is already resolved, pointing at a building and narrating its stillness. Ethan sat on the back bumper of the ambulance and let a paramedic clean the cut on his left hand. The cut was along the pad of his palm, below the ring finger. Not deep, not structural, the kind of thing that bleeds more than it warrants because of the vascularity of the hand, The paramedic, a young woman with her hair in a tight bun and the professional demeanor of someone who had seen enough genuine emergencies to find this one unimpressive, worked without commenting on how he'd gotten it. He hadn't told her. She hadn't asked. The transaction had an efficiency he appreciated. The detective assigned to his statement had been standing 5 feet away for the past 10 minutes with a notepad and the patient expression of a man who understood that the paramedic came first and was willing to wait, which already told Ethan something about him. Detective Ray Solis. Mid-40s, the kind of thick that was muscle going soft rather than fat. A wedding ring he kept touching without seeming to know he was doing it. Good instincts, probably. The patient ones usually did. "Mr. Rourke," Solis said when the paramedic began rapping, "whenever you're ready." "I'm ready," Ethan said. "You want to walk me through it?" "From the beginning or from when I separated from the main group?" "From wherever it started for you." So Ethan walked him through it. He was precise and factual and left out almost everything that mattered. Not the sequence of events, which he described accurately and in order, but the internal architecture of it, the calculations and the preparations and the hour of incremental work that had preceded the 4 seconds in the corridor. He described it the way a man describes something that happened to him rather than something he built, and Solis wrote it down. And somewhere in the middle of the writing, Solis stopped and looked up. "The floor panel," Solis said. "The silent alarm. You knew that was there?" "I suspected buildings of that type and age might have them," Ethan said. "After the floods in the district a few years back, a lot of commercial properties added water monitoring infrastructure. Some of those systems have secondary alarm functions." Solis looked at him with an expression that was not quite skeptical and not quite credulous. The expression of a man calibrating. Most people, they're on the floor of a bank with a gun pointed at them. They're not thinking about flood monitoring systems. "I had time to think," Ethan said. "Uh-huh." Solis wrote something. "Prior military?" A pause. Not hesitation. Something more considered. "Yes." "Branch?" "Navy." "What rate?" Ethan looked at him. Solis looked back. The question was specific. Rate was Navy enlisted terminology, not the civilian phrasing, which meant Solis either had a family member who'd served or had done this interview before with people like Ethan. "Special warfare," Ethan said. Solis wrote it down. He didn't make a show of it. "How long ago?" "I separated 8 years ago." 8 years is a long time to remember how to do what you did in that corridor. "Some things don't work on a timer," Ethan said. Solis nodded slowly, the nod of a man who accepts an answer without necessarily accepting all of what it doesn't say. He asked several more questions: the location of the restrained gunman, the specifics of the alarm panel, the sequence of the takedowns. And Ethan answered each one with the same flat precision, and at the end, Solis closed his notepad and extended his hand. "We're going to need you for follow-up," Solis said. "Probably tomorrow, maybe the day after." "I'll be available." "Is there somewhere I can reach you?" Ethan gave him a number. Solis wrote it down. "Mr. Rourke." Solis paused. "I've been doing this 22 years. I've taken a lot of statements from a lot of people who were in a lot of bad rooms." Another pause. "I don't think I've ever written down a statement like yours." Ethan looked at him. "How so?" "The part where you don't sound like you were scared," Solis said. "Not because you're tough, because you were working. The whole time you were working." He tapped the notepad against his thigh. "That's a specific kind of person." Ethan didn't respond to that. He pulled the sleeve of his jacket back down over the wrapped hand. "My daughter's waiting for me," he said. Solis stepped back. "Go." Ethan stood, and the paramedic who had been collecting her materials looked up with the reflexive professional concern of someone checking that a patient wasn't about to pass out, and he gave her a brief nod that said, "I'm fine," and crossed the parking lot toward the perimeter tape. He got 4 steps before the reporters found him. They came from the left, which was the direction he hadn't checked, which was an error he filed without self-recrimination because he'd been in a parking lot behind police tape in broad daylight and not a hostile environment, and there is a cost to shifting out of one mode of awareness and into another, and sometimes you pay it in small ways. The camera was in his face before he'd registered the approach, and the reporter, a young man, early 30s, with the practiced forward lean of broadcast journalism, was already talking. "Sir, can you tell us, You were inside the bank during the incident. Can you confirm? No comment, Ethan said. He kept walking. Eyewitnesses say one individual was responsible for subduing the suspects. No comment. Sir, your name, if you could just... He went under the tape. He didn't run. He walked at the pace of a man who has somewhere to be and has made a decision, and the reporter stopped at the tape because the officer standing beside it gave him a look that ended the pursuit. Ethan walked 2 blocks to where he'd parked his truck, a 2009 Tacoma with 190,000 miles on it and a dent in the passenger door that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. His hands were on the wheel. The wrapped one ached in the dull, persistent way that hand injuries ache. He looked at the windshield and breathed. His phone had 7 missed calls, 4 from a number he didn't recognize, probably the monitoring situation cascading through channels he'd been associated with at some point, and 3 from a number he knew by heart, the one that lived at the top of his contacts under a name that just said Lily. He called it back. She picked up on the first ring. Dad. Her voice was the specific register of a 16-year-old who has heard something on the news and is trying to sound calmer than she is. Dad, are you... I saw the thing on my phone, the news alert, First Meridian Bank. Is that where you... Yeah, he said. I'm fine. You're fine. Completely. You always say completely when you're not completely. He almost smiled. I have a small cut on my hand. That's the total damage. Silence. Not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of someone absorbing relief, which is its own specific sound. What happened? She said. They're saying someone stopped the robbers. They're not saying who. Some things happened, he said. I'll tell you over dinner. Dad? Lily. Were you... Did you... She stopped, started again. Did you do the thing? He knew what she meant. They had talked about it once, obliquely, the way they talked about certain parts of his past. Not directly, not with the full weight of it, but in the way that children of people who have done specific things understand without being told. She was 8 when he separated from the teams. She was 16 now. She had done 8 years of her own math. Yeah, he said. I did the thing. Another silence. Then, are you coming home for dinner? I'll pick up Ty, he said. The place on Clement. The one with the good spring rolls or the other one? The one with the good spring rolls. Okay, she said, and then quieter. Dad, I'm glad you're okay. Me too, kid, he said. He sat in the truck for another minute after he hung up, and then he started the engine and he drove. The news cycle found his name by the following morning. He hadn't given it to the reporters in the parking lot, but 28 other people had been in that bank, and names have a way of surfacing when enough people are talking to enough other people who are talking to cameras. By 10 a.m., the morning after the robbery, Ethan Rourke's name was attached to at least 4 news stories across 3 local outlets, and by noon it had been picked up by 2 national aggregators. And by mid-afternoon there were people outside his apartment building on Cabrillo Street with cameras, which was the thing he had been hoping would not happen and had known probably would. He took Lily out the back of the building and drove to his sister's place in Daly City, and his sister, Carol, 3 years older, sharp and practical, and the only person in his life who had ever successfully argued him into anything, met them at the door with an expression that was equal parts relief and exasperation. You couldn't have just been a regular person at the bank, she said. I was a regular person, he said. I was transferring tuition money. And then things happened. She pulled him inside. She fed Lily, who was old enough to understand that the adults needed a conversation and young enough to accept the plate of food as sufficient compensation for being excluded from it. Carol sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table with her coffee mug and looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since he was 7 years old and she was 10. The way that says, I see exactly what you're not saying. How bad was it? She said. Nobody died, he said. All 30 hostages walked out. I didn't ask how it ended. I asked how bad it was. He thought about this. About the moment in the corridor when the shotgun had gone off and the pressure wave had hit him and his hands had moved before the sound had finished traveling. About the 4 seconds that were not 4 seconds from the inside. About 30 people on a marble floor and the calculations he'd run for an hour and whether any of those calculations had had a margin for error that he'd been honest enough to account for. It was manageable, he said. Carol looked at him for a long moment. Manageable, she repeated. Yes. Ethan. Carol. She shook her head. Not dismissal. The specific head movement of someone who loves a person and has accepted, not happily but finally, that some rooms in that person cannot be entered. They want to do a segment on you, she said. The news. I've had 3 calls on my cell since this morning. I don't know how they got my number. Don't talk to them. I know not to talk to them. I'm telling you they called. Thank you. What are you going to do? Wait for it to pass, he said. It always passes. It didn't pass as quickly as he wanted. The story had the particular traction of something that speaks to a specific hunger. The ordinary man who turned out to be extraordinary. The single father who turned out to have a past. The mystery of competence in the wrong context. People wanted to know who Ethan Rourke was, and he declined to tell them, which is of course the thing that makes people want to know more. He stayed at Carol's for 3 days. Lily missed 2 days of school, which he hated but couldn't fix. He cooked dinner both nights in Carol's kitchen, because cooking was the thing he did when his mind needed something mechanical and low stakes, and Carol's kids, 9 and 12, loud and uncomplicated in the way that well-loved children are, absorbed Lily into their orbit with the ease of the young, and he stood over a pan of chicken thighs and listened to 3 teenagers bicker over a game in the next room and felt the specific, almost painful gratitude of someone who has come close enough to not having this to understand what this is worth. On the 4th day, he went back to his apartment. The cameras were gone. He went to the grocery store. He picked Lily up from school. He did the things that the days were made of. He was unloading groceries Thursday evening when his phone rang from an unknown number, and he almost didn't answer it, except that the prefix was a business exchange rather than a personal one, and something in him was still wired to pick up rather than screen. Mr. Rourke, a woman's voice, precise, not unfriendly, with the quality of someone who knows exactly what she wants to say and has prepared the words in advance. My name is Camille Hawthorne. I believe we've met. He set down a carton of milk. Ms. Hawthorne. I got your number through Detective Solis, she said. He was reluctant to give it to me. I was persuasive. I imagine you generally are, he said. A brief pause that might have been surprise or might have been assessment. I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee, she said. If you're willing. Not for the press, not for any public purpose, just, I think I owe you something and I haven't been able to identify exactly what it is, and I'd like to try. He thought about it for a moment. Through the wall he could hear Lily's music, whatever she was listening to these days, something with too much bass, and the ordinary domestic sound of it was both anchor and argument. There's a place on Judah, he said, farther down, near 46th, small. They don't get much foot traffic. When? Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be there, she said. And then, after a pause that was fractionally too long for pure professionalism, thank you, Mr. Rourke, for everything, not just for the coffee. He didn't have a clean response to that, so he didn't offer one. He said goodbye and hung up and stood in his kitchen for a moment, and then put the rest of the groceries away. The coffee place on Judah was everything he'd described. Small, slightly dim, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that had been written and partially erased and rewritten enough times that the ghost text of previous offerings was permanently embedded in the surface. The owner knew Ethan by a nod rather than a name, which was the exact kind of recognition he preferred. He arrived 12 minutes early and sat in the corner with his back to the wall and a view of the door, which was habit rather than necessity, or maybe necessity that had become habit, which is how most things about him worked. Camille arrived 4 minutes before 9. She was different outside the bank, or rather, she was the same person freed from an extreme circumstance, which meant the circumstances of the bank had been in some ways more revealing than this was. She wore dark jeans and a jacket that was expensive but not displaying itself as expensive, the way some clothes announce themselves and others don't. And she carried no attorneys. She looked around the coffee shop once and found him immediately and crossed to the corner table without doing the thing that people sometimes do in unfamiliar spaces, which is pause and wait to be oriented. She sat down across from him. You look better, she said. Then what? Than the last time I saw you, when you were restraining an armed man on a concrete floor. Low bar, he said. She almost smiled. It was a different almost smile than the polished expressions he'd seen her manage in the bank lobby. Smaller, more honest, with a tiredness behind it that the professional surface had been covering. "How's the hand?" "Fine." It didn't look fine. "It's healing. It was a small cut." I saw a man take a shotgun blast 3 feet from his head and then disarm 2 people in a hallway. "I'm going to reserve the right to think the hand was not small." He looked at her. She held it without flinching, which he'd expected. She had held harder things than eye contact in the past week. "How are you?" he said. The question seemed to land differently than she'd anticipated. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she became, briefly, less composed. Not visibly distressed, but less assembled, like something underneath the assembly was admitting to its own weight. "I've been answering that question all week," she said. "Attorneys, insurance people, the board, my PR team. Everyone asking how I am. I'm asking differently than they are." "I know." She looked at her coffee cup. "I keep thinking about the moment he grabbed my arm. And I keep thinking, I was 2 seconds from something, and I knew I was 2 seconds from something, and I also knew that there was nothing I could do about it. And I have spent my entire adult life making sure I'm never in a room where there's nothing I can do." "That's an exhausting way to live," he said. "It's an effective one," she said. "Until it isn't." She looked up. "Until it isn't," she agreed, and said it with the specific weight of someone who has recently and undeniably experienced the until. The coffee arrived. The owner set it down without comment and left. Outside on Judah Street, a streetcar went by, the sound of it filling the room for a moment and then receding. "I want to ask you something," Camille said, "and I want you to understand that it's not the CEO asking. It's just me asking." "Go ahead." "When you went into that corridor with him," she said, "with the leader, you knew what was going to happen. You knew roughly how it was going to resolve, didn't you?" He thought about how to answer this. "I knew what I was building toward," he said. "I didn't know every step. There's a difference between a plan and an outcome. The outcome is what you're working toward. The plan is whatever the situation allows." "But you weren't afraid," she said. "I kept watching you, and I couldn't find the fear." "I was afraid," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Of what?" "That I'd get it wrong," he said. "That the timing would be off by a second, or the alarm wouldn't trip, or the corridor would be too narrow to control the engagement, and someone out in the lobby would pay for my mistake." He turned the coffee cup. "I wasn't afraid of what would happen to me. I was afraid of what would happen if I failed." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you go?" she said. "When he came to you. When you told him about the vault, and he took you instead of me. Why did you do that?" He looked at her. "Because if I'd stayed quiet, you might have been the example he needed to make, and I couldn't sit there and watch that happen. You didn't know me." "Didn't matter," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in her expression that she wasn't controlling, which he suspected was unusual for her. "It mattered to me," she said. He didn't respond to that. He drank his coffee. She set her cup down and folded her hands on the table, and he recognized the shift, from the personal register back toward the prepared, the thing she'd come with before the conversation had taken them somewhere else first. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Head of security for Hawthorne Capital Ventures. Director level. The compensation is significant. I had HR prepare a package. I can send it to you." "No," he said. She paused. "You haven't heard the number." "It won't change the answer." "Ethan." She said his name with the directness of someone who doesn't use first names casually and has decided to. "You are... What you did in that bank was not an accident of circumstance. That's a specific and rare capability. What I'm offering you is a chance to use it in a way that... I know what you're offering," he said, "and I understand why you think it's the right thing to offer me. It probably is by most measures." He set his cup down. "I have a daughter. She's 16. She's going to be gone in 2 years. College, her own life, whatever she builds. And I have 2 years left of the version of us that exists right now, which is the version where she still needs me in the daily way, the practical way. The version where I'm there in the morning and at dinner, and she tells me things because I'm there to tell them to." He looked at his hands, the wrapped one. "I lost 4 years of that already. When I was in the teams, 4 years of her being small that I didn't get because I was somewhere else being useful to other things." He looked up. I'm not giving back any more of the years I have left. Camille was very still. No amount of money? She said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way you ask something you need the full answer to. No, he said. Not because money doesn't matter. I'm transferring $4,000 in tuition payments out of a savings account I spent a summer building. Money matters. He said it without apology or performance. But Lily matters more. And I made a decision a long time ago about which one wins when they go up against each other. She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Outside, another streetcar. The owner behind the counter doing something with cups. Can I ask what you do now? She said. Day to day. Building maintenance, he said, for a property management company. And I do security consulting, some private, some contract. Nothing that takes me away from home overnight. I coach my daughter's friend group's weekend soccer games because the actual coach moved away and nobody else stepped up. He paused. It's not impressive. It's not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. Something harder, something more. I don't know. Compensating. Some guys go that way, he said. I understood what I was leaving. I wanted to make sure I was actually leaving it, not just changing the uniform. She looked at him with an expression that had no professional category. It was the look of someone encountering a perspective that is completely foreign to their own experience and is doing the work of actually sitting with it rather than filing it. I've been running at something my entire adult life, she said. Every deal, every acquisition, every quarter, I've been running at something and I'm good at it and I don't think I actually know what I'm running toward. He didn't have a response to that. It wasn't the kind of thing that benefited from a response. I'm sorry about the vault story, he said after a moment. In the corridor, that was, don't apologize for that, she said immediately. Don't. He nodded. She looked at him for a long moment and then she picked up her coffee cup and they sat in the small place on Judas Street with the mismatched chairs and the ghost text on the chalkboard and the streetcars going by outside. And something in the conversation had arrived somewhere that neither of them had mapped out in advance, which was maybe the only kind of arrival that actually means anything. I'm not ready for this to be where our story ends, she said. Quietly, but directly. She was the kind of person who said things directly when she had decided to say them. He looked at her. He didn't look away. I figured, he said. She waited. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. Not the job. The other thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned forward slightly, both hands around the coffee cup, and she began to talk. What Camille proposed, sitting across from him in that small coffee shop on Judas Street with the streetcars going by, and her hands around a cup that had gone cold, was not what he expected. He had expected another version of the job offer. A restructured pitch, different framing, better numbers. Because that was how people like Camille operated when the first approach didn't land. They didn't abandon the position, they found another angle into it. He'd sat across from enough commanding officers and government contractors and civilian liaisons in enough rooms to recognize the shape of a negotiation that hadn't concluded yet. But that wasn't what she said. She said, I want to build something, not for my company, not for my board, something independent, and I want to know if you'd consider building it with me. He was quiet. He let her talk. She had been thinking about it, she said, since the night of the robbery. Not continuously. She'd had the usual bureaucratic aftermath to manage, the insurance and the police follow-up, and the board calls and the press statements. But underneath all of that, like a low-frequency signal running beneath louder noise, she'd been thinking about the lobby. About 30 people on a marble floor who had no idea what to do. About the young mother covering her child's head with both hands because covering was the only option available to her. About Gerald Ashby going pale and liquid-eyed the moment things moved faster than his training. About herself, Camille Hawthorne, who had negotiated 9-figure acquisitions and managed hundreds of employees and run a company through 2 recessions, sitting against a stone column and understanding for the first time that she had no framework for this. There was nothing, she said. Not one person in that room, besides you, who had any idea what to do. Not the security guard, not the bank manager, not me. 30 people, and the entire extent of our combined crisis response was to put our hands over our heads and hope. That's not a failure of character, Ethan said. It's a failure of preparation. Most people have never been in a room like that. There's no reason they'd know. Exactly, she said. There's no reason they'd know. And there's no reason that has to be true, she leaned forward. What you did in that bank, not the physical part, the tactical part, started before they walked in the door. You assessed the room. You identified the variables. You built contingencies. And you did all of it in real time, in a situation you hadn't anticipated, because that kind of thinking is a skill that you learned and practiced until it became reflex. She paused. That's teachable, Ethan. The fundamentals of it are teachable. Not the SEAL version, not what you can do specifically, but the underlying principles. Situational awareness, calm assessment under pressure, how to think when your body is trying to override your brain, how to protect yourself and the people near you before panic makes every option worse. He looked at her. You want to train civilians? I want to build an organization that trains them, she said. Crisis response education, not fear-based, not the kind that just makes people more anxious about all the things that can go wrong, the kind that actually gives people tools. Schools, companies, community organizations, hospitals. The places where people gather and where, when something goes wrong, the difference between prepared and unprepared is the difference between, she stopped, between walking out and not walking out. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. That's a significant undertaking, he said. I know. The curriculum development alone, you'd need people with operational experience across a range of scenarios. Medical, fire, active threat, chemical. The variables are not small. I know that too. And the liability structure for training civilians in this kind of material is, Ethan. She looked at him steadily. I've been building complex organizations since I was 26 years old. I know what the problems are. I'm not asking you to solve them with me right now. I'm asking whether the idea is worth solving them for. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside, a streetcar. The owner behind the counter dropped something metal that clattered and then was still. What's my role? He said. Equal partner, she said. Not employee, not consultant, partner, co-founder. The operational architecture, the curriculum, the instructors, the training methodology, that's yours. I'll handle the funding structure, the organizational framework, the partnerships. We each do what we're actually good at. I'm not good at boardrooms, he said. You're better than you think, she said. But that's not what I need from you. I need you in the rooms where we teach. I need you to build the thing that actually works. He was quiet again, longer this time. She waited. She had the quality of someone who has learned that certain silences shouldn't be filled, which he suspected had not come naturally to her, and had been acquired through the specific discipline of professional negotiation. But it was real now. The waiting was genuine, not tactical. Lily can't be affected, he said finally. My schedule, my presence at home, that's non-negotiable. If we're traveling, if we're building regional programs, I need to know that the baseline of her life stays intact. We can structure it that way, Camille said. I mean that genuinely, not as a concession. And I don't take a title that sounds like I'm in a suit, he said. She almost smiled. Director of Training Operations. That's borderline. I'll work on it. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked down at his hands, the wrapped one, the unwrapped one. And he thought about 30 people on a marble floor, and the young mother, and Gerald Ashby, and all the rooms and all the buildings and all the cities that were full of people who had never thought about what they'd do until the moment when thinking about it was already too late. Okay, he said. She blinked. Just once, quick. Okay? Yeah, he said. Let's build it. What followed was not cinematic. It was, like most things that matter, mostly work. The first 3 months were the organizational groundwork, the legal entity, the nonprofit structure that Camille had decided on after 2 weeks of consultation with attorneys and tax advisors. The initial funding that she seeded from her own capital and from 3 other investors she called in the first week, people who owed her or believed in her or both. Ethan sat in on 2 of those investor meetings and didn't say much and watched Camille in a room of people with money and understood something about her that the bank had only partially shown him. She was extraordinary at this, not in the showy way of people who perform competence, in the way of someone for whom this thinking came as naturally as the other kind of thinking came to him, clean, efficient, always 3 moves ahead, and with a human precision in reading the room that was, he thought, not entirely unlike what he did with physical spaces. They didn't talk about it directly, but he saw it. and she saw him seeing it, and that was a different kind of conversation. He spent those first months building the curriculum framework. He pulled in 3 people he trusted: a former Air Force combat controller named Dennis, who had gone into emergency management after his separation, a woman named Rosa, who had worked trauma response for a major metropolitan fire department for 15 years, and a former FBI negotiator named Wallace, who was 61 and semi-retired, and whom Ethan had to call 4 times before he picked up. Together, they built the skeleton of something that Ethan kept describing to Camille as not a survival class. "Then what is it?" she asked once, early on, sitting across from him at the long table in the office space they'd leased in the Sunset District. A converted light industrial building, high ceilings, good natural light, the kind of space that feels provisional until it doesn't. "It's a thinking class," he said. "The physical stuff is secondary. The primary thing we're teaching is how to stay in your own head when everything outside it is telling you to vacate." She considered this. "That's going to be a hard sell to schools." "Not if we frame it as decision-making under pressure," he said. "Every school administrator in the country wants their staff to make better decisions under pressure. This is that. The specific application is crisis, but the skill transfers." She looked at him for a moment. "You're better at this than you told me you'd be." "I said I wasn't good at boardrooms," he said. "I didn't say I wasn't good at this." They launched the pilot program in month 4. 2 companies, 1 school district, 1 hospital system, participants. Camille had secured through her existing network, organizations willing to take a chance on something new in exchange for reduced rates and the credibility of Camille's name attached to it. Ethan ran the sessions himself for the first 2 months, with Dennis and Rosa assisting and Wallace doing the negotiation and communication modules that were, according to the early feedback, the ones that hit hardest. It was harder than building anything Ethan had built before, and he had built things in worse conditions than this. The curriculum kept needing adjustment. What landed in a corporate setting didn't land the same way in a school, and what worked with trained hospital staff didn't work the same way with administrative personnel who'd never thought about their environment as a system they could influence. He rewrote sections. He sat in the back of sessions and watched Dennis teach, and took notes on what changed in the room, and went home and adjusted the material and tried again. There were bad sessions. A workshop at a financial services company where the participants were contemptuous in the specific way of people who have decided something is beneath them before it begins. And he'd had to rebuild the room's attention from scratch in the first 10 minutes or lose it entirely. A school session where a teacher broke down crying halfway through the active threat portion because she had a friend who'd been in a shooting 6 years earlier, and the material had surfaced something she hadn't known was still that close to the surface, and they'd had to pause and regroup, and Ethan had sat with her in the hallway for 20 minutes while the rest of the session waited, because that was what the moment required. He told Camille about the teacher that evening. They had developed the habit of a call most evenings, sometimes long, sometimes brief, always direct, that had started as operational debrief and had evolved into something less categorizable. "Was she okay?" Camille asked. "She stayed for the rest of the session," he said. "Came up after and said she was glad she did." "That's..." Camille paused. "That's the hard part of this work." "Yeah," he said. "It is." A brief silence on the line. He was sitting on his back steps with a beer he'd barely touched, the evening fog coming in off the ocean the way it came in every evening, which was one of the things he'd always liked about this part of the city. Through the window behind him, he could hear Lily on a video call with someone, her voice carrying the particular half-laughing cadence of a teenager in her natural environment. "Can I ask you something?" Camille said. "Sure." "When you were still in the teams," she said, was it ever too much? The work?" He thought about how to answer this. I took his time with it, because the question was a real one, and she was asking it in the way of someone who genuinely wanted the real answer rather than the manageable one. "There was one mission," he said. "I'm not going to give you specifics, but we went in for a rescue extraction, and the timing was off by it wasn't much. Minutes. And we got the people out, but we got them out after something had already happened to them that we were supposed to prevent." He was quiet for a second. "I didn't sleep right for about 8 months after that. Not badly, Zach. I functioned fine, but there was this thing behind my eyes when I tried to sleep that just wouldn't resolve." "What resolved it?" "Lily," he said simply. "She was 2. She used to wake up at 5:30, and I'd go get her and we'd sit on the couch and she'd fall back asleep on my chest and I'd just sit there. And after a while, the thing behind my eyes started to get smaller. Not gone, smaller. He paused. She's never known she did that for me. I've never told her. Silence on the line. The good kind. You should tell her, Camille said. Maybe, he said, when she's older. She's 16, Ethan. That's old enough. He considered this. Maybe, he said again. Lily met Camille for the first time in month 6, on a Saturday in November when Camille had come to the office to go over the second quarter projections, and Ethan had brought Lily along because Carol was out of town and the teenager had nowhere else to be and had expressed, with the specific teenage combination of forced indifference and obvious interest, that she didn't mind seeing the place her father kept talking about. Ethan had been expecting awkwardness, not disaster, just the standard friction of two people from very different contexts meeting through a third person who mattered to both of them. What he had not been expecting was Lily to look at Camille for approximately 30 seconds, and then say, with the directness that she had inherited from him and refined into her own particular instrument, "Are you the one who made him do this instead of just staying retired from doing things?" Camille looked at him. He looked at the wall. Not exactly, Camille said. But kind of, Lily said. Kind of, Camille agreed. Lily considered this. Okay, she said, and walked over to examine the curriculum boards on the wall with the focused, absorbing attention of a person who is more interested than she intends to show. Camille looked at him again. Her expression had something in it that was partly stunned and partly something warmer than that. She's yours, Camille said quietly. Yeah, he said. They had dinner together that evening, the three of them, at a Vietnamese place Lily had requested because she always requested Vietnamese. And it was loud and imperfect, and Lily interrogated Camille about the business with a thoroughness that made Ethan want to apologize and made Camille respond with a fullness of answer that said she was not remotely bothered. Lily caught Camille in one factual inconsistency about the nonprofit's funding structure and pointed it out with the relish of a 16-year-old who has been paying attention, and Camille laughed. Not politely, actually laughed, surprised out of composure for a second, and corrected herself. Walking back to the car afterward, Lily fell into step beside Ethan and said, without looking at him, I like her. Yeah, he said. She's not fake, Lily said. A lot of people that successful are fake. She's not. He didn't say anything for a moment. I know, he said. Lily glanced at him. She had his eyes, which was either fortunate or unfortunate depending on the day and who was on the receiving end. Dad. Lily. It's okay, she said. Just that. He looked at her. She was already looking ahead, walking, doing the teenage thing of delivering a significant thing and then moving past it before it could become a moment, which was pure self-protection and also completely effective. Okay, he said. The training center opened 11 months after that first coffee on Judah Street. It occupied the converted building in the Sunset that had started as a provisional lease and had been progressively built out until it was something real: training rooms, a simulated environment space, administrative offices, a small library of crisis response materials that Wallace had contributed from 40 years of collection. The exterior sign was modest. Ethan had insisted on modest. The name they'd eventually landed on, after 3 weeks of argument, was the Meridian Institute. Camille had proposed it. Ethan had initially resisted it because it referenced the bank, and he didn't want the bank to be the story. Camille had argued that the bank was precisely the story, not the robbery, but the gap it revealed, the thing they were now filling, and that naming it Meridian was not trading on the incident, but acknowledging where the question had first become unavoidable. He'd given in, which he didn't do often because she was right, which was something he was getting used to. The opening ceremony was a Tuesday morning in October. The fog had burned off by 9, which Lily called doing it on purpose, and which had the quality of a day that had decided to cooperate. The people who had been in the bank came, most of them: Gerald Ashby, who had lost 20 pounds and looked better for it, the elderly woman whose name was Margaret Osei, and who had brought flowers, the young mother named Diane, whose 4-year-old was now 5, and had no memory of the morning that had changed her mother's understanding of everything, the teenage boy who had shaken like a wire in wind, the red-faced businessman in the conference suit, the young man with the earbuds. They came because Ethan had personally written each of them a letter. Not an email, a letter, handwritten, which had taken him 3 evenings. And because the letter had not asked them to celebrate, but had simply said, "You were part of what this is built from, and I wanted you to see what it became." Detective Solis came. He stood in the back with his arms crossed and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who had been around enough things starting to know what the ones that last look like. Priya and Marcus came together, and Priya hugged Ethan in the entrance with a conviction that startled him, and then didn't. Carol came with her kids. The 9 and 12-year-olds were impressed primarily by the simulated environment room, which had been built to allow training in controlled low-light and high-stress conditions, and which they evaluated with the authority of children who have played many video games. Lily stood near the front and watched all of it with the particular expression of a teenager who is moved but will not perform being moved, which Ethan recognized because he had the same limitation. There were no speeches. Ethan had refused speeches. What there was instead was a demonstration. Dennis running a 15-minute session with a group of volunteer participants, the entry-level version of what the Meridian Institute now offered to anyone who walked through the door, the foundational thing. How to read a room, how to identify exits without looking like you're identifying exits, how to breathe correctly under pressure, which sounds simple and is not. How to make 3 decisions in the time your body is trying to make 0. Camille stood beside Ethan and watched the demonstration. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was the one she wore when she was absorbing something rather than performing an appropriate response to it. "Is it what you imagined?" he said. "No," she said. He looked at her. "It's better," she said. "I imagined something more polished. This is more real." He looked back at the demonstration. Dennis was asking the volunteer participants to stand up and tell the room one thing they'd noticed about their environment since walking in: exits, structural features, anything. And the answers were tentative and partial and genuine, people discovering what they'd absorbed without knowing they were absorbing it, which was exactly the point. "That teacher," Ethan said, "the one from the school session, the one who broke down." "What about her?" "She sent a letter," he said. 2 weeks ago. Said she'd run an informal version of the awareness module with her class. Not the crisis content, just the observation piece, the room reading exercise. Said her students were more present afterward, more engaged. She said she thought it was because they'd been given permission to pay attention. Camille was quiet for a moment. "Permission to pay attention," she said. "That's what she said. That's—" She stopped. "That might be the clearest description of what we're doing that I've heard." He nodded. "I'm going to put it in the curriculum intro," he said. "Credit to her." She looked at him. "You know, when I sat down across from you in that bank and watched you move a chair 3 inches and couldn't figure out why, I thought you were— I don't know what I thought. Something very specific and very separate from the rest of us. And now?" She considered it. "Now I think you're specific," she said, "but not separate. I think the thing you do, the attention, the assessment, the staying present when everything else is trying to pull you out of your own head, I think that's something that lives in everybody. Dormant, maybe. Undeveloped, but there." He looked at her. "That's the whole argument for what we're doing," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm a slow learner." "You're the opposite of a slow learner." "About some things," she said. Something passed between them in the quiet after that. Not a declaration, not a resolution, not the kind of articulated thing that gets turned into a moment. Just the acknowledgement that something had been building in the same way that things built in that lobby had been building. Incrementally, practically, without announcement, and that it had arrived somewhere real. Neither of them said it out loud. Neither of them needed to. The last people to leave the opening were Margaret Osei, who shook Ethan's hand with both of hers and told him he was a good man, which he neither confirmed nor denied, and Lily, who had stayed to help fold chairs with a volunteer energy that was entirely unlike her usual negotiated participation in domestic tasks. When the building was empty and the lights were down to the working minimum, Ethan walked through it once. The training rooms, the simulation space, the library, the entrance, the way he'd walked through the bank lobby on that morning 11 months ago, assessing, exits, structural features, what was load-bearing and what wasn't, old habit, the kind that becomes reflex, the kind that had, on a Tuesday morning in a downtown bank, been the difference between 30 people walking out and not walking out. He thought, standing in the entrance of the building with the October air coming in from the street and the city doing its ordinary evening things outside, about what it costs to be the person who pays attention when everyone else has stopped. The real cost of it, not the physical danger, which was specific and containable, but the other thing. The way it sets you apart in rooms, the way it makes you the person who sees the exits while everyone else is reading the menu. The loneliness of a particular kind of readiness that most people never need to develop because most people never find themselves in the rooms where it matters. He had carried that loneliness for a long time, had carried it so thoroughly that it had started to feel like identity rather than circumstance. And then a bank lobby, and then 30 people on a marble floor, and then a woman across a coffee cup asking him to build something, not because she needed his capability, but because she believed in the idea underneath it. Nobody gets to choose the rooms that change them. You walk through a door you've walked through 100 times, and on the 101st time, everything in the room is different. The doors don't announce themselves. They just open, or they close, and you're either on the right side or you're not. Ethan Rourke had spent most of his adult life making sure he was on the right side of whatever door was in front of him. He was good at it. It had cost him things. It had given him things. The accounting was complex and ongoing and probably wouldn't final balance until it was over. But standing in the entrance of the Meridian Institute on a Tuesday evening in October, with his daughter's voice coming from somewhere in the back where she was still, apparently, organizing things that didn't need organizing, and Camille's car still parked outside because she had stayed later than she'd planned, because she always stayed later than she'd planned, he thought that the accounting, right now, in this specific moment, was closer to even than it had been in a long time. He thought about Lily at 2 years old, asleep on his chest in the pre-dawn dark, the weight of her unimaginably complete. He thought about the thing behind his eyes that she had slowly reduced without knowing she was doing it. He should tell her. Camille was right about that. She was old enough. He would tell her tonight, he decided. Over dinner, probably, or after, sometime in the ordinary geography of an evening at home. Not as a speech, but as a fact that had been kept private long enough and could now be released into the ordinary air. Some things don't need to be carried alone just because you started carrying them alone. That was something he was still learning after everything. After all the training and all the years and all the rooms. Still finding the edge of what he knew and stepping past it. Which was, he supposed, the entire point. The city hummed outside. The fog was coming in again off the ocean, the way it always came in, indifferent and reliable, softening the edges of everything it touched. Through the building's high windows, the last of the daylight was going orange and then gray, and in the back of the Meridian Institute, his daughter was doing something unnecessary and helpful with chairs. And tomorrow there were sessions to run and curriculum to refine, and 100 imperfect ordinary tasks that together built the thing they were building. He stood in the entrance and let the evening come in, and then he turned the lights off and